A brand new teacher walked into her first classroom, and within minutes, a student asked her, dead serious, if she was British. She wasn't from another country. She was from about an hour north of that exact same county in the same state, in the same country these kids had lived in their entire lives. That's the moment that kicked off one of the biggest threads this community has ever produced. Can you get genuine culture shock without ever leaving your own country? The answers came flooding in, and the theme that kept surfacing was simple. The United States is so large that it doesn't really behave like one culture. It behaves like dozens, stacked on top of each other, sharing a passport. Take that teacher's story further. She was working in the southern end of a county in West Virginia, right along a river that splits the region in two. The northern half connects easily to a neighboring state by bridge. The southern half stays more isolated. One accent, 1 hour apart, sounded foreign enough to a group of teenagers that British was their honest first guess. And that's not even the most extreme version of this story. Some people described entering what felt like a genuinely different country without crossing a single state line. One commenter described visiting a specific county in the same state and being unable to understand some locals at all, needing an actual translator mid-conversation, in a shop, in his own home state. Another grew up an hour away and still described the accent there as something out of a different century, one he didn't think still existed until he heard it in person. This is the part that gets me every time I read it. Nobody in that thread was talking about a language barrier. They were talking about their own state, their own country, and it might as well have been a different one. Scale it up from counties to entire cities, and the culture shock only gets bigger. Someone described flying into a massive East Coast airport and being unable to judge the size of the buildings from the ground. Everything reads as too large to process at first glance. Then minutes later, one specific neighborhood turns out to be surprisingly quiet and friendly, nothing like the stereotype. There's even a semi-serious local rule that gets repeated as advice to tourists. Stay off certain sidewalks between 4 and 6 in the evening, because that's rush hour. And half a city is trying to get home at the exact same time you're trying to take photos. And the flip side of that same story showed up constantly. People from small towns describing their first trip to a big city as genuinely disorienting, more people on one single block than their entire hometown holds. Then there's the state that basically turned regional pride into its own personality, and everyone in the thread had a story about it. Someone checked into a hotel in this state and found the waffles at breakfast were literally shaped like the state's outline. Coffee sizes at the counter weren't small, medium, large. They were small, medium, and the state's own name. A dairy company based 1,000 miles away, in a completely different state, still runs local ads built entirely around name-dropping this one state, because studies apparently show the advertising works roughly 40% better the moment that word appears. Even pickup trucks get a special state edition trim level, sold nationwide, that amounts to some extra chrome and a badge, and yet people specifically seek it out. One person joked that the state functions as a completely free trademark that everyone in it uses constantly, and somehow it never gets old to the people living there. On the complete opposite end of the emotional spectrum, moving between small towns and cities revealed something people found genuinely touching, not just funny. Someone who grew up in a big city went to college in a small Idaho town and was baffled the first time a total stranger waved at them on the sidewalk. A local born and raised worked retail there, and once asked a recent transplant from New York what the biggest adjustment had been. His answer, he'd waved to more people in his first month in that small town than in his entire life back home. It's a small detail, but it flips the emotional weight of culture shock completely. This one wasn't jarring in a bad way. People described it as something they had to consciously readjust to, and more than once said they genuinely missed it after moving away. Now here's a detail from this thread that most people outside the country have simply never had a reason to think about, an entire nation functioning inside the nation. Someone described driving through a Native American reservation in Arizona and flipping on the local radio station out of curiosity. The DJ was speaking entirely in the Navajo language. The top 20 songs played that week were completely ordinary pop hits, except number 16. Turned out to be a full 15-minute traditional tribal song, drums and all, followed immediately by a car dealership commercial, again entirely in Navajo, except for one phrase that stayed in English, the truck's brand name. And that's not a small quirky exception, it's a structural fact. The Navajo Nation is large enough by both land and population to run its own radio and television, its own community colleges, and its own tribal park system alongside elections that function closer to state-level politics than local ones. A huge number of Navajo citizens live and work well beyond the reservation in cities across 2 neighboring states, holding public university degrees, speaking fluent English, while the nation itself takes deliberate structural steps to keep the Navajo language alive for the next generation. It's genuinely one of the most overlooked facts about the country. There are functioning nations within the nation with their own institutions running in parallel the entire time, and most Americans outside the immediate region have never had a reason to notice. Then there's the culture shock that isn't about geography at all. It's about which building people spend their Sunday morning in, or whether they spend it in one at all. Someone who grew up going to a loud, joyful, music-filled black church described visiting a quiet, more subdued denomination for the first time and feeling like something was almost missing. It ran the other direction too. Someone raised Catholic described visiting a Baptist service and being taken aback by the spontaneous shouting of amen mid-sermon, something that simply doesn't happen in the services they grew up with. More than one person, of different backgrounds entirely, admitted that experiencing a black church service for the first time, purely for the music, made them want to start going to church again, despite not being especially religious at all. And on the complete opposite end, someone raised in a very churched community moved to the Pacific Northwest as an adult and realized, with genuine surprise, that most people around them didn't attend any religious service whatsoever. A Sunday morning there looks like any other morning, which was itself a small, quiet shock. So what does all of this actually add up to? An accent that sounds foreign one county over. A 4-hour flight that lands somewhere that feels like a different planet. A state that turned its own name into a marketing strategy. A radio station broadcasting entirely in a language most Americans have never heard spoken. A wave from a stranger that feels like a small act of kindness instead of an intrusion. None of that requires a passport. All of it happens inside one country's borders. And that's really the through line connecting every single story in this thread. The word American gets used like it describes one culture, one accent, one set of habits, but the honest answer over and over from people who've actually lived in more than one corner of it is that the country is less like a single culture and more like a very large, very loosely connected federation of them, sharing a currency, a language, and a flag, and not a whole lot else. If a country this size can produce genuine culture shock without anyone ever crossing a border, wait until you hear the real reason Americans think a 4-hour drive barely counts as far. It connects directly to everything in this video, and it's coming up next. Tell me in the comments, what's the biggest culture shock you've had inside your own country?